Yeah, because part of the work I have been doing has to do with Malayalam literature. Because as you know, English departments are a kind of funny kind of place now in the university. Yeah? And sometimes I have felt that they are defined as the department where everything except English literature is actually taught. Because a few years ago, I used to work in Delhi University for a long time. I moved to JNU only a couple of years ago. And when I was in Delhi University, at one point I was looking after the MPhil program, and I was arranging for the end of the course Viva Voce examinations of all students. We had 36 students in that batch. And out of these 36 students, I think people who wrote their dissertations on what we consider English literature were like 6. Yeah? And then there were people who worked on other kinds of literature like Indian literature or world literature. Then there were people who worked on film studies, culture studies. And then there were people who worked on things which had nothing really to do with literature or culture, but with social practices. Like students from the Northeast who want to look at one particular kind of social practice prevalent in a particular locality. A kind of work which you would traditionally think of as work which would happen in a sociology department or anthropology department. And then there are some students who also work on historical material, like colonial archives. Again, from the Northeast, there is some very significant work which has taken place in English departments of this kind. Now, this also poses some challenges because we are not really trained to supervise these projects. You can, of course, extend your competence from the area in which you specialized to other areas like culture studies or film studies or study of things which are broadly related to art and culture. But when you are actually dealing with social practices or historical facts or processes, then we are also dealing with methods of investigation and ways of evidence collection which are very different from that we are used to in literature. So we try to address that. I think the challenge that many English departments face at the moment is about cooperating with other departments to overcome this difficulty. Like you can actually cooperate with some colleagues from history department or some colleagues from sociology or other departments in order to train these people. Now, Rochelle has been speaking to you, and Rochelle's own work is a great example of this. We were colleagues in Delhi University for a long time. And her own work actually is very close to historical research. And also her more recent work has quite a lot to do with ethnographic work, which I think she spoke to you about. Now, my work is also a little bit, over the years, trying to deal with some issues of history and some issues of politics as they have impacted on the production of literature. So I still consider myself as somebody who works clearly within the field of literary studies, but since literature itself does not live in a kind of vacuum, part of that work is really to do with discourses which are not literary discourses at all, like discourses which belong to history or to the political world or whatever it is. So what are the kind of issues which come up when we deal with material of that kind? How does a literary scholar or literary studies scholar see the relationship between these different kinds of discourses? This, I think, is a question which might interest many of you, because even though the particular texts or writers that I'm going to speak about may not interest you very much, through them the kind of problems that we are trying to deal with, that might be relevant to many of the projects that you yourself are involved with. So if there is something which you think is self-evident or not clear or something, just stop me right there. So if there is any point which you which is not very clear, or which you have an objection to, immediately stop me, and we will go over that again. And I'll speak probably for an hour, and after that we can have a time for discussion as well. So we will do 2 sessions like that. And then some of my more recent work, which has come out of this kind of preoccupation, has to do with certain forms of cultural production which have become increasingly important in our times, which has to do with a kind of politics which is very closely linked to mourning or lamentation, things which are related to the question of death. So I hope to speak about that in the short session tomorrow. There are certain intersecting connections which hopefully will become visible as we go along. And Rochelle also told me that some of you had raised questions about oral history and Dalit memory. So some of those issues will come up in this second kind of work that I would speak about. Yeah. Yeah, so let's actually begin with a simple, seemingly simple question. When we speak about the politics of literary texts, what kind of things do we usually look for? Like most of us would accept that even literary texts which are not directly about politics have some kind of politics. In our times, there is the widely held belief that everything is political in some sense. So there is a politics to literary texts, politics to syllabus making, politics to publishing, politics even to the kind of experience of literary pleasure that we get. So in a classroom, for example, when we look at the politics of literary texts, what would be the kind of issues that we look at? What do you think? Can we have some responses? Just something to build up the conversation with. Yes, please. Now, I'm sure all of you have ideas. All of you must be doing this in the classroom. Yeah? Yeah, like think about any text which you have been dealing with, and what do we look for? Yes, yeah. Please. Yeah. The question is, can I move around, or is it a problem? Yeah. Because when camera is put there, you feel worried. Yeah. So my question was a simple question. That is, all of us agree that, most of us agree that often there is a kind of politics to literature, political dimension to literature. Yeah? Like if you take any kind of novel, like Arundhati Roy's Ministry of Utmost Happiness, or God of Small Things, or Dalit novels, or women's writing, we agree that there is some kind of political dimension to these texts. Now, what do we look at in order to explain what the politics is? How do we pose the question of politics? Yes, power structure implied in a narrative. That is one response. Yes.
Caste, religion, identity.
Questions of caste, religion, identity. Yeah.
Issues of class question.
Class, of course.
Minorities.
Gender.
Yes.
Then gender issues.
Yes. Class, minorities, gender.
Politics of aesthetics.
Politics of aesthetics. Yes.
The position taken by the author.
Pardon?
The
Truth, power, and knowledge.
Truth, power, and knowledge.
How it is shared and how it impacts on the signified perspectives.
Right. Absolutely.
I think the position taken by the author is more crucial.
Right. Now, excellent. You have come up with actually the whole range of things which we actually identify as politics, ranging from the politics of aesthetics or the politics of signifying structures, as you mentioned, to questions of caste, identity, class relationships, questions of gender, and then to the political position taken by the author. Now, how do we identify the political position taken by the author? Where do we find this question of class or caste? Is it to be found in the events which are represented? Are we to think of a work as a anti-woman work or anti-Dalit work if women characters are presented as weak or Dalit characters are presented as weak? How much can we trust the author's own remarks about what he or she is writing when it comes to literary texts? So these are the kind of questions with which I would like to begin, because I feel that these questions in some way or the other get into most of our research and most of our teaching. Yeah? Now, about the question of the author, which you correctly pointed out, is an important thing. Now, you know that there are lots of occasions where the author may actually explain his or her work in one particular kind of way, but people who read the work may feel that this is not really what the work is doing. Yeah? Now, the classic examples of this we are familiar with. When the Marxist critic Lukács wrote his famous Studies in European Realism, he made this point that when Balzac began writing his novel about the peasantry, what he was trying to do was actually to write a novel which shows the slyness and cunning and all the bad characteristics of the peasantry. Yeah? But having written the novel, when people read this novel, they are moved to tears by the predicament that the peasantry lives in. Yeah? So here we have two ideas, separate ideas. One is the author's own kind of intended project. Yeah? On the other hand, the kind of affects or emotions which are generated by the work when people read it. Yeah? So for Lukács, this was actually the true sign of realism. This was not a failure. This was actually really the success of a realist novelist. His argument was that a great realist novelist, when he produces a novel, the novel goes beyond the intended project of the writer, who belongs to a particular class and who is trying to express a class point of view. But a great realist novel goes beyond that narrow class position and actually represents what Lukács would call the objective relations within society. Yeah? Now, the other famous example, of course, from European literature is Dostoevsky. You know that Brothers Karamazov, when Dostoevsky began writing Brothers Karamazov, it is actually meant as a kind of reply to nihilism and atheism. At a time when there was such a sense of meaninglessness and lack of faith and the questioning of everything which is happening in Russia, and these are very persuasive arguments and positions, Dostoevsky was engaged in a struggle with these positions. And in Brothers Karamazov, there is this major character, Ivan Karamazov, who is a rationalist and he's a nihilist. And the question that constantly preoccupies him is, if God does not exist, then everything becomes possible. There cannot be any values. So how can one live one's life in that world without values? This is the kind of question that Ivan Karamazov is actually addressing. Now, Dostoevsky thought of his novel as giving a reply to this question through the figure of Ivan's younger brother Alyosha, who is actually a religious person, and his master, spiritual master, Father Zosima. These two religious figures, through not just their beliefs, but through their piety, through the quality of virtue that they embody, is seen as giving a kind of reply to this atheistic position. Yeah? But once you read the novel, the effect that you may encounter is probably the opposite. That is, if you come to the novel actually with strong belief in God, probably by the time you reach the end of the novel, that belief would be seriously shaken. And people often consider this as an example of the success of that novel. And Dostoevsky, of course, towards the end of his life, he wanted to rewrite the entire novel. So we know that the author's own position is important, but we cannot always treat the author's position as the position that is prevalent in the text. So even when you said the author's position is important, what we mean by that is the position which is evident in the text, isn't it? In the novel or in the poem. And that position may actually be different from the position that the author is expressing in interviews and letters and articles and things of that kind. Yeah? This we are familiar with. Now, the problem is, where do we find the author's position in literary texts? Is it to be found in the ending of the story? Exclusions. What else? See, she was suggesting that we should look for the politics of the text in what the text excludes. This is one powerful argument. And anything else? Any other idea?
Inclusions as well.
Inclusions, okay. Yeah. Yeah, what the text speaks about. Yeah. And
Correlating images.
pardon?
Correlating images.
Images.
Underlying text.
Yeah, images. What are the image structures which are being used? Yeah. Myths. Yes. Anything else? What about the plot? What about the story? The question which I, some of the simplistic arguments used to be that who wins in the text. You remember that whether a text was moral or immoral. In English literature, you know these debates from the 18th century, for example, like Samuel Johnson, people like that, saying that Shakespeare's plays are not always moral, because sometimes evil characters triumph, and virtuous characters are punished. So, do you think that plot structure and what happens to characters itself is an important element in understanding the position of the text? If not, why is that the case? Any comments on that?
We have lost interest in the obvious.
Lost interest in the?
Obvious.
Yeah. Lost interest in the obvious. That's correct. So now people often do not say that. But you will see a variant of this argument coming up among many of the things which our students routinely write, and which many of us also routinely write, saying that this particular author does not represent characters of a certain kind as agents. Yeah? Like many times I see students writing papers saying that this work is actually misogynistic because the women characters are denied any kind of agency. Yeah? Or people saying that Dalit characters or people of minority, etc., are denied any sort of agency. Yeah? Now, agency is an important idea, and one of the things which I would like to clarify in these lectures is to understand this concept of agency and how it works. Yeah? So, but agency is very clearly related to plot. It's a plot which actually allows us to see whether characters are agentive, whether they are performing actions which are significant, and actions which affect the outcome of the novel. These are things related to the plot. So I see the argument about agency as one of the ways in which that obvious argument about the plot still continues to live. Yeah? How far can we push it? This is one question which comes up. Now, let us look at this question of exclusions. Now, one issue, in the case of Malayalam literature, you know that many recent critics over the last 20 years or so have pointed out that many of our early novels do not really represent characters from many communities. Think about the celebrated first novel, Udayakumar. It's not really the first novel, but the first significant novel. Yeah. So in Udayakumar, you do not have, mainly the characters are Hindu upper caste characters, and it's mainly a Nair story from Malabar, and it of course makes fun of some Nambudiri characters. Although Chandramenon says that I have the greatest respect for Nambudiris and some of my best friends are Nambudiris, etc., etc. And there is only one Muslim figure who appears, and that is when Madhavan is traveling by train, and this Muslim character, we do not know if he is actually Muslim. He is dressed up like a Muslim elite figure, and he tricks Madhavan and steals everything from him. So you could say that this is a kind of exclusion, or this is a kind of negative portrayal. You do not have, this is written in Malabar, but you still do not have any Muslim characters, so that can be seen as an exclusion. And you have this one representation of an image of a Muslim figure which is associated with deception and crime. And of course, you do not have any characters who come from what were called untouchable castes at that time. There is nothing of that kind. Now, this is one kind of exclusion. Now, we know that a novel does not speak about everything that happens in society. All novels, all works of art work by some kind of selection. Some kind of selection meaning they construct reality in a particular kind of way. There is no novel which can be like a mirror to the world and empirically reflect everything that happens in the world. So in that sense, we know that all works of art are constructed by a principle of exclusion. Some kind of exclusion is essential to the creation of all works of art. So just because a work does not speak about something, it does not become a significant exclusion. Yeah? So of course, some exclusions are significant, like in the arguments about Indulekha. How do we make an argument about a significant exclusion? It's not enough to say that these characters are excluded or these communities are excluded. We have to show that such an exclusion is significant. So what makes an exclusion significant? This is actually one of the conceptual questions we need to kind of talk about in relationship to the question of politics. Now here, an important set of arguments were made by Marxist critics of the 1960s, Althusser, for example, and this very important literary theorist of that time, Pierre Macheray, who worked in close proximity with Althusser. And Althusser's own argument, he first makes not in relationship to literature. He initially makes that argument in relationship to his reading of Marx's Das Kapital. Yeah? What Althusser says is a bit like this. He says that Das Kapital, as you know, is a critique of political economy. So in that, there are long discussions of the theories of political economy which are advanced by theorists before Marx, like Adam Smith, for example, Ricardo, for example. So a lot of Das Kapital is actually a kind of implicit debate with these thinkers. Now the question Althusser asks is, how does Marx read Adam Smith? What is he actually looking for when he reads Adam Smith? And Althusser's reply is a bit like this. Like, see, it's not like Marx's genius or Marx's originality was in recognizing that the workers were exploited. You do not need to be a genius to notice that, because workers are living in extremely miserable conditions at that time. So of course, the fact that workers are exploited is not a new insight. Marx's insight, of course, is that, or argument is that this particular kind of exploitation of workers is central to the structure of capitalism. It is central to the structure of the commodity. The commodity itself involves this extraction of an additional value which comes from the labor power of human beings. This is the kind of argument that he makes. Now, Adam Smith, of course, recognizes this. In Adam Smith's own reading, you have many elements which actually notice particular aspects of the capitalist economy. But he is unable to make the argument that structurally this is essential to capitalism. That is, the idea of surplus value, which Marx comes up with, that Adam Smith is unable to recognize. Because if he recognizes this idea of surplus value, then the entire theory of political economy that he has built up, that would fall apart. Yeah? So Althusser's argument is that when Marx reads Adam Smith, he is not interested in, no, he is interested in, of course, but he is not so interested in what Adam Smith is actually saying, but he is even more interested in what Adam Smith cannot say within his framework. The idea that Adam Smith's theory is actually based upon something which he cannot say within that framework. Okay? Now, it's important to understand that this notion of what you cannot say is not identical to what you do not say. Adam Smith does not speak about a lot of things in his book, but all of that does not become part of this segment that we call what Adam Smith cannot say. This, what you cannot say, is a kind of inability. That inability is intrinsic to the framework you have adopted. Yeah? Once you have adopted that framework, you are unable to see certain things, you are unable to speak about certain things. And once those things are brought into the framework itself will collapse. Yeah? So the distinction, so this is the argument about exclusion. That is, there is a kind of wide range of exclusions which are there at the heart of any theoretical argument. And by extension, any artistic work. There are a lot of things that the works of art do not speak about. But there are certain things which the work of art cannot speak about if it has to remain coherent. Yeah? So, Althusser gave the name symptomatic reading to this kind of reading. Yeah. That is, what you cannot say, what you are silent about, that comes up or manifests itself in certain incoherences within the text itself, certain contradictions within the text, certain incoherences within the text. So instead of looking at the coherence of the text, you focus on this little moment of slippage or this little moment of incoherence, because that is a symptomatic moment. That incoherence is a symptom of something which has been repressed, something which the text cannot speak about. Yeah? So you can understand that this argument really is indebted to psychoanalysis. The word symptom in some sense actually indicates that. And the word symptom is a symptom of that dependence, you could say. Yeah? So in psychoanalysis, like you know that in Freud there is the famous argument that in dreams what really matters is not what you are dreaming about. See, Freud himself, when he first began working on dreams, he worked with the symbolic meanings of the dream images. Now, a lot of psychoanalytic critics still do that. Like if you dream about a snake, it's about sex, things like that. But Freud very quickly moves beyond that position. That is, it's not the dream images that we need to look at, but how they are arranged. In other words, it's not a dream dictionary that you need to produce, but the grammar of dreams, the syntax of dreams. How are these images arranged together? And then he goes on to the point of saying that in that grammar itself, what really matters is the moments of incoherence. The moments when there is some disturbing element coming in, which is quickly set aside in the dream. Sometimes even the abrupt waking up can actually be a discontinuity of that kind. Of course, we must remember that we do not actually remember the dreams exactly as we dreamt them. The moment we wake up and we try to recount, already there is a kind of revision which takes place. Yeah? And later on when you recount it, when you try to interpret, you are revising it further and further. But there is the idea that when you look at a dream, what you need to look at is not really the coherence of the dream, but the moments of incoherence. And Freud used to say, of course he had read Arthur Conan Doyle's Sherlock Holmes, and he would say that psychoanalysis in that sense is a bit like detective work. Yeah? A detective who goes into the scene of a crime, he does not really expect to find direct signs of who the murderer is. The murderer does not leave his visiting card. Murder made to look like a scene of normalcy. That is what you need to look at. So, in the case of literary texts, Pierre Machery following Althusser would argue what we need to look at are those kinds of moments of hiccup in the text, the moments of some kind of incoherence in the text or contradiction in the text, which the text is quickly trying to cover up and make look as if it is normal. Yeah? So, one of the things which is important in literary research in relationship to the question of politics and the question of the complex relationship between literature and reality, so to say, is in identifying this significant exclusion and differentiating it from insignificant exclusion. Because I say this because in our times, generally, arguments about exclusion have a lot of purchase. So often it is the case that we confuse these two things. Just because a text does not speak about people of a particular gender or a particular caste or a particular community or class, that doesn't necessarily mean that it is a significant exclusion. We need to demonstrate that it's a significant exclusion. And the way of demonstrating that is that if this exclusion is actually remedied, that is, if an element of this kind is to be introduced into the text, then the apparent coherence of the text will collapse. That is what we need to demonstrate. We need to demonstrate that the entire universe built up by the text is dependent on this exclusion. Yeah? That is, it is built up on this exclusion. And if that moment is brought to light, then that universe itself will actually crumble and collapse. This is what we would need to demonstrate. Okay? Is it clear what I am saying? Yes. Yeah. Then, one more point. We know that the apparent way in which a story is told, or the aim of a story, as it is kind of directly put forth in a novel, may actually not always be in consonance with how the novel works in the activity of reading. I'll give you one example, then it will become clear. All of us, all the English literature teachers in the classroom would know that when the novel began coming up as a form in the 18th century, there was major anxiety about women reading novels. Because you know that by the 19th century, women become the major element in the history of the novel, and they begin writing novels, and they are reading novels a lot. Even in the 18th century, that is beginning to happen. Now, what is the anxiety about women reading novels? Now, very similar arguments are made in India in the 19th century, late 19th century and early 20th century especially, about women reading magazines in which novels are getting serialized. Like the literary historian Venkata Chalapati, who works on Tamil, he is actually one of the historians of reading, so to say. And he has tracked this. When Tamil popular novels in the 1910s are getting serialized in magazines, there is a lot of anxiety about how women should not be allowed to read these novels. And the arguments which are made are very similar to arguments made in the 18th century in England. One argument is that novels induce daydreaming. Now, what is daydreaming? Daydreaming is different from the kind of dreams that Freud analyzed in the interpretation of dreams, although we must remember that Freud's own initial understanding of literature is a kind of daydreaming. That is one of the first essays, early essays he writes about literature. Daydreaming is a kind of phenomenon where you kind of enter into fantasies and occupy positions in a fantastic narrative, a fantasy narrative, instead of being in complete consciousness about the real world. So just as you are a housewife working in the kitchen, you can actually identify yourself in fantasy as a a woman of a different kind, having experiences of a different kind, etc., etc. The fear that the male critics of the 18th century and the moral custodians of the 18th century had was that women would be induced to imagine themselves as different from what they actually are. Yeah? So one of the first novels that we speak about in the English literature class in the 18th century is Samuel Richardson's Pamela. Yeah? And you know that Samuel Richardson was, his beliefs were not only Christian, they were puritanical. And Pamela is actually written as a novel to illustrate the importance of virtue, female. It's called Virtue Rewarded. Yeah. And so you know that the story involves Pamela, this guy, Lord B, isn't it, the name? He is trying to seduce Pamela, and Pamela resists that. At one point, he is about to rape her, and Pamela tells him that you may be able to possess my body, but you cannot possess my mind, etc., etc. And at one point, there is a symbolic rape which happens in the novel, which is the stealing of her letters, her diary, her diary and the letters, and so that is seen as actually the violation of interiority, so to say. And anyway, Lord B eventually, gives up, and he begins courting her and loving her and eventually marrying her. So this is the idea of virtue rewarded. Yeah. But interestingly enough, one of the people who really liked this novel was the French writer Marquis de Sade, after whom we have the word sadism. Yeah. Yeah. Marquis de Sade actually reworked this plot line in a number of novels like Justine, Juliet, etc., etc., which are also about some virtuous woman being seduced by a libertine, and she is resisting it, and this libertine actually subjects her to various kinds of cruel sexual torture of various kinds, so sexual possession of various kinds, and the virtuousness of the woman and the narration of the story of this libertine aggressing her and possessing her becomes a kind of fantasy of sadistic pleasure. Yeah? Yeah? So Marquis de Sade's own novels are very, very interested in keeping the woman as virtuous. But the virtuous woman's forced participation in these kinds of sexual fantasies, so to say, narrative fantasies, is seen as giving a kind of erotic pleasure which Samuel Richardson probably never imagined his novels would inspire. Yeah? So what I'm trying to show is actually this complexity of what the novelist meant to do, and also what he actually does. He creates a structure with a moral message. He creates a plot with a moral message. Yeah? But this narrative itself, in spite of its moral message, may actually give rise to reading practices and reading activities which are completely at variance with what was initially set up. In the light of this, we can understand the anxiety about daydreaming. Because you may write a novel against adultery, where a woman indulging in adultery is punished, and virtuous, and man indulging in adultery is also punished, and virtuous men and women are rewarded. Yeah? But the reader may actually enjoy the pages where the adultery is happening. Yeah? And the overall narrative frame, where eventually there is some kind of moral consolation at the end, you may also feel that, okay, I'm not really indulging in immoral fantasies. But the pleasure that you derive from the novel may really come from these passages, or the bulk of the novel may be about that. And at the end you may get a bit of a, yes, please.
I remember having read one essay.
Yeah.
It is titled The Modes of Fiction in 1840.
Yes.
So in which, generally we will think that the literature of written that time
Yes.
be, reading is different.
Yes.
It's voluptuous books that are written.
That's right, absolutely. That's very, very important. So there is a popular reading, which actually may be completely at variance with these high-sounding, ideas which are propounded. So what I'm trying to get at is a principle which probably we need to recognize even more strongly when we are studying and teaching literature. That is these plots, which often people take to be some kind of way in which the novel carries out its political or moral function, the plot is merely like a prop on a theatrical stage. You know that when we want to produce plays, we need props. Like if there is a murder scene, we need a knife, and you have tables and chairs, but this is not what the play is. Even characters are not what the play is. It is some event which is actually taking place on the stage and being witnessed by people, and people, of course, laugh or cry or whatever it is. That is actually the play. The play is an event which takes place. Now, all these are necessary elements for that event to take place. That is, be it the particular objects which are on stage, or the actors who are there to perform the role of characters, or the kind of music which is played in the background, or the kind of dialogue which is uttered on the stage. All these are actually like props. Their arrangement in this kind of as parts of a machine, and you make the machine work, and this event unfolds in front of you. So the plot is also a prop of that kind. The apparent moral organization of the plot may actually be like an element in this machine. But what the machine does, what kind of effects it produces, may not be fully explicable in terms of the plot line. So is it clear? See? So two kinds of consequences from what I have been saying so far. After this I will shift. This is like a kind of introduction. One consequence, as I pointed out, is that we cannot really think about all exclusions as significant exclusions. Similarly, all inclusions are also not significant inclusions. We have to show that this inclusion is actually excluding something else, and that exclusion is a significant exclusion. This is one idea. So the notion of a symptomatic reading, to see if an exclusion is a sign of what the text cannot speak about, rather than merely what the text does not speak about. The second point I was trying to make was about the question of narrative plot, and this is different from the author's views expressed outside the text. We are not concerned about what Samuel Richardson wrote about Pamela, but while reading Pamela, it is very clear from the authorial position which is evident in the text, evident in the plot, that it has a moral message, and it is announced in the title, it is announced in the narratorial judgment on characters, the characters with which we are meant to morally sympathize. In all these things it is evident, but it is very well possible that the same narrative apparatus can give rise to a reading which goes against the grain of this moral orientation. So moral tales, politically correct tales, religious tales, many of these tales can actually have a plot line which gives rise to emotions or affects which are contrary to the orientation of the plot. And we know that the same text can actually be read in totally different ways at different points in time. And Martin Esslin, when he wrote about Waiting for Godot, he says that I think it is there, my memory is beginning to go, so it may not be there in that book. He says that one of the important productions, most meaningful productions of Waiting for Godot was in a prison. Because the people actually could read things into it which are actually not there in the apparent level of the play. And you know that about 15-20 years ago, when I was in the university, I read a report in a newspaper saying that a production of Waiting for Godot in South Africa eventually led to some kind of violence, because Lucky and Pozo, the two characters come, they were represented as a white master and a black slave, and that changes the scene. So you can see how the same text, the plot line actually can be read quite differently. Sometimes, as in the case of the pornographic reading of puritanical tales that I mentioned, completely contrary to the avowed intentions of the plot. So these are the 2 points which I initially wanted to begin with. Now I want to shift gears and speak about a somewhat different issue, which does this clock work? Yes. In my JNU classroom, the clock is always 2 o'clock. Yeah. See, behind what I have been saying so far, there is also the assumption that literary texts are meant to be read in a way which is a bit different from we read other texts. Yeah? You do not read a literary text like a political pamphlet. You do not read a literary text like a religious document. You do not read it like a newspaper report. Yeah? You do not read it like a scientific document. We are aware of that. But what is the special thing about literature? What's the specificity about the literary text? This is a question for which we do not have a very satisfactory answer yet. And probably we will never have a very satisfactory answer, because the difficulty we face is part of that configuration that we call literature in modern times. Yeah? When I was a student in Trivandrum, Professor Ayyappa Panikar was one of our teachers. We were in some of the last batches that he taught. And I remember him saying that Tennyson's line, half a league, half a league, half a league they went. If someone asks, why can't you be more economical and say they went 1.5 leagues? Yeah. Now, we know that that is not poetic writing. Yeah? There, the signified is not solely important. It is actually the repetition of that half a league, half a league, half a league, which is more important than the actual quantity. Yeah? So, but at the same time, you know that you cannot write a newspaper report like that. You have people who have read Love in the Time of Cholera of Marquez. You know that the hero, when he gets employed in this as an accountant, as a clerk in this company, the letters he writes, it's impossible to send them, because these letters are ornate, elaborate letters. They cannot be sent as business letters at all. So we think that there is a difference in the way in which we use discourse in literature. But at the same time, so see, one consequence of this is the assumption that literature, even when it speaks about reality, is not really like a report on reality. There is an element of the fictional in it, even when it speaks about reality. Even when you write a novel about Napoleon, we know that all sentences which are attributed to Napoleon may not have been uttered by Napoleon in real life. All the thoughts attributed to Napoleon, we cannot verify if he ever had those thoughts. Yeah? And finally, all the events which are documented in the novel, they may not actually have happened. And sometimes some characters are invented in the middle of a historical novel which has a lot of historical personages. You may have a purely imaginary character, like Ananda Padmanabhan in C.V. Raman Pilla's Marthanda Varma. Although there has been an argument in recent years that Ananda Padmanabhan was actually modeled on a Nada, Ananda Padmanabhan Nada, to whom Marthanda Varma gave land, etc., etc. So, but here he is fictionalized into the form of an Nair hero, etc., etc. So, this is one assumption we have. That is, even when it pretends to be reality, there is a pretense, an element of what people call the as if about literature. It may look as if it is about reality, but there is a certain kind of distinction which has to be made. But at the same time, we know that the world does not respect this distinction all the time. We only need to think about the controversies around satanic verses when it came out. Actually, many of you may have been very young at that time. I actually taught a part of Satanic Verses in a university where I was teaching before it became so controversial. I was teaching a course on Introduction to Literary Analysis or something like that, and we looked at the first chapter of Satanic Verses where these two characters are actually this falling from this aeroplane, and singing Hindi film songs, and often a criticism is made against people who criticize Satanic Verses that they did not read the novel. Yeah? But they are not interested in reading the novel. They are not making literary criticism. Their criticism about Satanic Verses is not that it is a bad work of art, but that it is an insult to the Prophet and to people who believe in the Prophet. Yeah? This is the criticism. Yeah? Now, there are so many examples from our own times. Even these past few days, you have seen many things of this kind coming up. What does it indicate? Now, a lot of literature scholars at that time took the position that no, this is not literature, this is literature, this is fiction. So the prophet, as the prophet appears in a novel, is not the historical prophet, even though the prophet is referred to. We shouldn't confuse it with making a kind of argument about the history of religion or making an argument about a theological issue. That's not what literature is trying to do. But people don't accept this. People who are affected by this, offended by this, they do not accept this decision. Now, this is not a new issue. This issue has been there from the beginnings of modernity, when literature begins to have this character of being a separate kind of discourse. Like in earlier times, you couldn't anyway make this argument. If you write a fictional story or a poem in which the king is represented badly, of course you will be punished. The idea that literature is not about reality, it has this kind of fictional nature, and it should have some kind of impunity, that idea itself is a modern idea. So in that sense, you could say that the idea of literature as a kind of aesthetic entity is a modern idea. In Europe, you begin to have conceptual articulation of this in the 18th century. That is when an argument comes up about the separateness of the aesthetic. Like Kant, for example, Immanuel Kant, when he writes his critique of judgment, which is, you could say that is the first major or fully elaborated articulation of a philosophical position about the distinctiveness of the aesthetic. He differentiates the aesthetic from two other kinds of discourses. One discourse is the discourse of knowledge or truth. The other is the discourse of morality, the discourse of the good, so to say. Yeah? So, to say that something is true is a judgment of knowledge. It is based on verification, all the kinds of things which we employ to find out what is true and what is untrue. Similarly, the question of what should I do, what is good, what is a value, these kinds of questions are answered through some kind of moral debate about moral principles. Is honesty always good? Yeah. And Kant has the famous example that imagine that a person who is being chased by a gang of murderers passes you and you see him running in one direction. After some time, the potential murderers who are after him, they come and ask you, have you seen a person running? Which way did he go? Should you be honest or should you not be? And interestingly, Kant said, you should be honest. Yeah. So judgments of honesty are a different kind of judgment from judgments of truth. That honesty here is a principle. You're honest because it's good to be honest. That's the right value. Judgments of the beautiful, Kant said, are different from both these things. That is, you do not have any interest of the truthfulness of what you are looking at. You do not have even an interest in if the representation is good, if it has good moral consequences. It is only by suspending both these kinds of judgments that you can actually appreciate something to be beautiful. So this is actually, you could say that this is a key statement in the history of the separation of the aesthetic domain from the domains of knowledge and the domains of morality, practical utility, etc. And often this example is cited: if three people go to a forest, and all of them love the forest, they enjoy the forest. One of them is a scientist. He loves the forest because it has some very rare species which are extinct in many places. So he loves the forest as a repository of these rare species. You could say that his loving the forest is a judgment of knowledge. Yeah? And then there is a timber contractor who goes there, and he also loves the forest because it is so many tons of wood which you can cut and sell. So his loving of the forest is a judgment of utility. Yeah? Then there may be a third person who loves the forest because it is beautiful. There, even the physical existence of the forest should not matter. If he dreams that he is in a forest, even that should give him the same pleasure. Or you could say that if he looks at a painting of a forest of that kind, it should give him the same pleasure. Yeah? So these are the ways in which the aesthetic was actually separated. It is on the basis of that separation that we keep making the argument that a novel is fundamentally different from the reality it speaks about or represents, and novel has a kind of as if or fictional nature to it, so it should be judged by completely different standards than the way in which you judge a political pamphlet or a religious tract or things of that kind. But the problem is that people do not respect its position. And this is not a new problem. From the beginnings of modernity, you will get this position as well. Like in Kerala, for instance, you know that Kumaranashan, the famous poet, towards the later period of his abruptly truncated life, wrote this poem called Duravasta. Yeah? It was written against the background of the Mappila rebellion in Malabar. And in that, it's a story, all of you know this, about a Nambudiri girl who escapes when her whole family is being murdered by the insurgent Muslim tenants and peasantry of the place. And she is recounting this story, and she takes refuge in the hut of a Pulaya, and eventually she becomes his wife. That she actually encourages him, and because he is shying away, he feels that he should not actually, he's kind of full of respect for her and treats her as his upper caste precious woman. But eventually it is she who invites him to her bed as her spouse, so to say. Yeah? Now, in that, this character called Savitri, who is the literary effects, so to say, things which you see as generated within what you call the literary apparatus. Yeah? But when you say that this particular phrase is hurtful to a community, you are actually speaking about an effect that a literary work has, which is not a literary effect. Yeah? So this is the point I am trying to develop. Just as in the case of Rushdie, Satanic Verses may be a great novel. I think it's a great novel. I think it's the best novel Salman Rushdie ever wrote. But the insult felt by and the outrage felt by a lot of Muslims about the references to the Prophet and the comments it makes on, or the kind of version it gives of this theological significance in Islam theological history, that is also real. It's not a literary response to it, but it is a non-literary consequence of a literary work. Yeah? So here, what we are saying is that a literary work has a literary existence within that domain that we call literature, but simultaneously, all literary works also have an existence within the wider world which does not respect the separateness of the literary as the final principle. Yeah? So, is it clear what I'm saying? Yeah? So, yeah, please.
It is also applicable in that case case of art also.
Yes, exactly. Emma Hussein. Yeah? Yeah.
And the cartoons.
Cartoons, yeah. The cartoons of Muhammad, Emma Hussein. There are so many issues in this sense. No, actually, we are living at a time where we are going through a kind of proliferation of these complaints, And the, a quick aside, since I'm tempted by this. Yes.
Can you contextualize the controversies regarding the story biryani?
Yeah, biryani again, See, how do you respond to that? Often people try to argue this on the ground of literature. But I see in this a constitutive problem about the nature in which literature exists in the modern world, which we are not going to be able to settle by saying that you should feel happy or you should feel unhappy. Yeah? That is the point I am trying to get at. Now, yes.
This controversy is deliberately made to market.
That also happens. Of course, that happens. See, that also is the marketing of literature. Is it literary phenomena or is it non-literary phenomena? Yeah. So when we say it's non-literary phenomena, we are behaving like Kant. Yeah. This is what I'm trying to get at. All of us are actually, I also have taken positions like that. And a few years ago, when I was teaching in Delhi University, there was this horrible thing which happened. A.K. Ramanujan's very beautiful essay called 300 Ramayanas, which is part of the BA history syllabus. There was some Hindutva agitation against it, and the history department, head of the department was roughed up, and these people who came to rough him up, they also called TV channels so that it's properly documented and it spreads. And initially they came asking, we want to actually, they came to beat up A.K. Ramanujan. They didn't know that he actually died some years ago. but then they realized, like there is a story about emergency, during the emergency, somebody had printed a Bertolt Brecht poem in Maharaja's College and circulated it. And the IB came and met the principal. Which batch is Brecht studying? Yeah, anyway, so let's get back. So this A.K. Ramanujan thing, then we also, who have been attacking this or taking positions against this aesthetic domain, I found myself making arguments that, this is actually a literary, an essay about literary imagination, and you shouldn't confuse it, etc., etc. But there are better arguments to be made about 300 Ramayanas. That's a different issue. Yeah.
As literary students, but
yeah.
Aren't we taught not to commit this mistake of reading the intention of an author as the true meaning, as we call it,
Yeah.
intentional fallacy?
Yeah. See, I think people of our generation are, people of even my generation, was actually taught to do that. But what I'm trying to say is that the question of the non-literary effects and the non-literary life of literary texts is not a matter of intention of the author. It can be, but it may not be. Like it may not be Salman Rushdie's intention to insult the Prophet, because that novel also has a kind of valorization of simple Muslim piety in the novel. Yeah. So similarly, it may not have been Kumaran Ashan's intention to insult the Malabar Muslims, but that doesn't matter. Just as it doesn't matter what the literary meaning of the text is, in these debates, the avowed intention of the author also doesn't matter. What matters is how does this literary text appear as a public document in the larger public space. This is the issue. So what I'm trying to suggest is that a literary text simultaneously has two kinds of existences. One is as a special utterance, which exists within the field of literature, which is of course regulated by certain principles, certain ideas, certain values of the age, etc., about literature. But all literary utterances also exist in society as ordinary utterances, as ordinary public utterances, yeah, which are received by people who are not necessarily working by the protocols of literature. Yeah. Is it clear what I'm trying to get at? Yeah. So I shall try to illustrate this by talking about one particular set of, couple of writers from Kerala in the early 20th century. Just to give you a sense of what I am trying to argue. After that we will return to the larger questions. In early 20th century, so actually when you read histories of the Malayalam novel, often you find that the first decade when novel began appearing, which is often seen as the last 10-12 years of the 19th century, from 1889 Indulekha, you also have Kundalada coming before that. Pulleli Kunju, existed before that. And then you have all these famous novels like Marthandavarma, Sugumari, Saraswati Vijayam, Parishkara Padi, then Lakshmi Keshavam, Meenakshi. There are many novels which appear in that last long decade of the 19th century. And then historians of the Malayalam novel often say that then there was a period of complete lull or stagnation in Malayalam novel until the 1910s, where C.V. Raman Pilla, after a long period of silence, writes a sequel to his Marthandavarma called Dharmaraja. And then later on he publishes Ramaraja Bahadur, his third novel, in 2 parts. So there is an idea that after this initial efflorescence of the novel, the form itself kind of, entered a static period. And there was a period where you did not have any novels, or significant novels at least. But if you look at that period, you will see that there were novels. There were novels, and not only were there novels, they were actually hotly debated when they came out. And they were subjects of a lot of discussion at that time. And this discussion is sometimes literary, sometimes non-literary. Yeah? And we do not read these novels now, except people who work on them, like me. You do not even find copies of them easily, because they are seen as ill-formed novels. They are seen as poor novels, failures, so to say. Because people often see them as written with some kind of clear political or moral purpose, and they are seen as artistically inelegant. I'll quickly speak in today's lectures about 2 authors here. One of them is this very important figure at that time called K. Narayana Kurukal. K. Narayana Kurukal was, he wrote 2 novels, but he actually wrote 3 novels, but 2 novels are important for us. One of them is called Parapuram, and the other one is called Udayabhanu. And Parapuram was actually written in 3 volumes, and Udayabhanu written in 4 volumes. Yeah, and his publisher, these novels were actually published by one of his friends, who is actually more famous and familiar to us now than Narayana Kurikal is. That is K. Ramakrishna Pilla, whom we know as Swadeshapimani Ramakrishna Pilla. Yeah? Now, K. Ramakrishna Pilla, as you know, was a newspaper editor. He was a political journalist, so to say, and he was also a literary critic, and he himself wrote a novel. That novel is called Naragathil Ninna. Naragathil Ninna is an epistolary novel, you could say. It's written in the form of letters, but these letters really come from hell. They are written by a corrupt bureaucrat after he dies, and he's written from purgatory or somewhere, and people are reading that. So these novels, Ramakrishna Pilla's novels, novel and Narayana Kurikal's novels appeared in this period, which we see as this period where novels didn't really take place. Yeah? Now, these novels would be seen as artistic failures and have only kind of political significance by critics now. This is because, what I'm trying to suggest is that this is because in the history of criticism about the novel, by the 1930s, 1940s, you get a kind of literary criticism which is getting established, which actually tells you what the signs of a good novel are, how novels should behave, and what is actually the fictional merit of a novel. You know? A kind of aesthetics of the novel begins to take root in the middle decades of the 20th century. One key text of that period, and a very important text, which many of you may have read already, is M.P. Paul's novel Sahityam. M.P. Paul wrote Chirikatha Prasthanam and novel Sahityam as, in some sense, modern day, how should I put it, literary theoretic texts, so to say. Like the way in which you have Vrittamanjari or Bhasha Bhushanam or things like that. Rajaraja Varma writing about metrics and topology and things like that. Similarly, you have a kind of modern day understanding of what a novel is and what short stories are. When I was a student in University College, we had to read a book called Introduction to the Study of Literature by William Hudson. Now, William Hudson wrote in the early decades of the 20th century, and what Paul is doing is a bit like that. In fact, Hudson is also an important influence on people like Paul. Now, in that you will see an essay on Indulekha, which is seen as one of the great novels of Malayalam. But Paul is unhappy with one chapter of Indulekha, that is the famous 18th chapter. You know that in Indulekha, just as Madhavan, who gets his wrong information that Indulekha is marrying this stupid Nambudiri, he goes on a kind of journey, out of despair. And finally he has been tracked, and his father and uncle catch up with him, and they spend a night in Bombay. So the novel is about, and Indulekha doesn't know he's back, and so the hero and the heroine are about to be reunited, which is what the novel is actually waiting for. And Madhavan himself would be considerably anxious about reuniting with Indulekha, but suddenly you have this long chapter where all of them spend a night talking about international congress, atheism, science, etc., etc. Yeah. So Paul says that this is actually a blemish on this otherwise beautiful novel. It is a kalangamana. But if you read the introduction to Indulekha, you will see that Chandamenon thought very differently. He says that I wrote this novel very fast. I wrote it over a period of 1.5 months or 1 month or something like that. But I couldn't complete it because in order to write this 18th chapter, I needed certain books. I had ordered them and I had to wait for them for a long time. So he delayed. For him, this chapter was really important. It's not a dispensable chapter. Yeah? Yeah. So why is it that Chandamenon thought, Chandamenon who could write that, what Paul considers as his gem of novel literature, does it mean that he had no sense? Does it mean that he had no literary sense and this happened by accident? Or is it the case that his understanding of what a novel ought to be was very different from what M.P. Paul later on would come to believe? So what I'm trying to get at is this peculiar change which happens in our understanding of novel. And novel is actually a symptom in the sense that novel is kind of paradigmatic of the modern idea of literature. Yeah? Yeah. And about that also there are some things, if I forget, please remind me. There are interesting things to talk about that. Novel is actually what makes visible the modern idea of literature. That it is about reality, but it is not reality, etc., etc. So our idea of the novel changes, and after the mid-20th century, retrospectively, we project these normative structures which have come up onto the early novel, and of course you cannot see good novels after the first decade. You cannot really see Narayana Kurikal's novel and novels and Ramakrishna Pillai's novel as important works in the history of the novel. Somebody who writes a history of the novel will mention them, but they will not have much to say about them. But if I was doing some work on these novels recently for precisely the reasons I have explained to you, and I was looking for criticism on these novels when it was published. And interestingly, the first review of this novel comes up in Rasika Ranjani, which was actually edited by Kodungalur Kunjukuttan Thambiran, and there is a very interesting review by him which is full of praise for the novel. And he says that this new novelist should actually be given pride of place in the names, among the names of novelists. Not at the bottom of the list, but somewhere near the top. This is what he says. So the understanding of what one expects from the novel is quite different at that time. Now, what are these novels? So, we may have to stop it when tea comes, but I'll begin that discussion anyway. These novels are about Travancore politics. They are written in the first decade of the 20th century, 1905, 1906. And they are satirical novels about the Travancore court, and the palace bureaucracy, and even about the king, Srimulam Tirunal, who was the king at that time. And they belong to a kind of discourse which was developing in the domain of politics. Now, we know that in Travancore, a certain discourse of politics really develops at the same time as the development of the novel. That is the last decade of the 20th century, 19th century. It is in the last decade of the 19th century that you get these famous mass petitions which are being submitted to the king. Like you have Malayali Memorial, which is submitted, a year after Indulekha was published in Malabar. And one of the people who were central to the drafting of Malayali Memorial was C.V. Raman Pilla, who was also publishing a novel around the same time. And Malayali Memorial was signed by about 10,000 people. And they came mainly from, it was led by these Naya reformers in Trivandrum and in Madras. But among the signatories, you will also find Syrian Christians and Iravas. The third signatory of that petition was Dr. Palpu, whom we know as the famous anti-caste campaigner from the Irava community. Now, 1896, you will see the submission of an even bigger petition called what we call the Irava Memorial. And it was drafted by Palpu, and he was also the main campaigner for collecting these signatures. And it's interesting to look at these petitions. And Palpu, I would say Palpu was actually, Palpu was a medical doctor, as you know. He was born in Peta. So we were talking about these petitions which were coming up at the end of the 19th century in Travancore. Now, we have to understand a couple of things here. One is about this, the nature of the petitions. Now, petitions are a kind of, I would say it's a new form of writing which really begins to develop at that time. Of course, you have an earlier idea of petitioning to the king, subjects going to show their face to the king and present their grievances. In Malayalam, the word which is often used is sangadam. So sangadam has two senses. One is sangadam is also a kind of an abstraction, and a difficulty, obstruction. And sangadam also is some kind of sorrow or grief. so you will find the word Sangada Harji coming up even in the 20th century. A scholar who completed his PhD from FLU was once working on some aspects of political discourses of that time. A scholar called Vipin, he teaches in Benares Hindu University now. So Vipin has some work on this Kumaranashan's own assembly speeches in Srimulam Assembly, where he says that idenda Sangadamana. And this Sangadam has a kind of, what I'm saying is that Sangadam has a kind of public discourse function at that time. Not merely a personal sorrow, but about a difficulty which you're presenting before authority in the form of a grievance, in the form of you're aggrieved grievance. So, petition, of course, has an older history of praja or subjects showing their face to the king and pleading with him, presenting what is causing sorrow to them and presenting it before the king. But in these mass petitions which are coming up in the late 19th century, you will see that form undergoing a kind of interesting transformation. Yeah? You will see a number of things coming up about precisely these issues in newspapers published from Madras. Many of them, they're published in English. Madras Herald, Madras Standard. So many of the writers of the Malayali Memorial also were writing articles about these issues in these English newspapers. So the language of this English newspaper writing is a bit different. Yeah? It is actually the language of colonial discourse, you could say colonial public sphere. Yeah? You have a language of that where you're speaking in terms of a language of public reasoning. Yeah? And you're making arguments based on facts and pointing to issues which are understandable by civil society at large, so to say, and of course the bureaucracy as well. So what you find in these petitions, mass petitions, is a coming together of two registers. On the one hand, there is a register which comes from the earlier idea of supplication. That is, as subjects, you are supplicating before the king. Yeah? There is a kind of ritualistic dimension to this. Yeah? Of the form of that supplication is that of prayer. Yeah? And in early modern England, you have that, which we have inherited through our colonial history. So in law courts, you will say, lawyers speaking to the judge, "Your Lordship, I pray." So this prayer is actually a kind of gesture of ritual supplication. Yeah? And at the same time, alongside that, you also begin to get a new register which comes from English language discourses and a colonial metropolitan discourses, be it Calcutta or Madras or places like that, where your addressees are English educated elite, and you're also talking to colonial authorities, you're speaking to bureaucrats, etc., etc. Yeah? So you begin to see a confluence of these two things coming up. Now, the place where it's most evident is the Irava Memorial, because Irava Memorial was actually submitted to the king in Malayalam, and I forgot to bring a copy of the Irava Memorial, otherwise one could have read out. It's not very long. It's a ritualistic kind of, it's marked by a lot of ritualistic gestures. It begins by saying Sri Padmanabhan Tune. Yeah? And then it goes on to say that, I don't remember the sentences, to the effect that we are supplicating before you, who are like, to the king, who is like a mother to us, like children come towards a mother crying, yeah, to plead with you about the sangadams we are actually suffering from, and it goes on to say that what the petition actually is claiming is that the Iravas should have the same kind of rights which are given to people from the lower castes who have converted to Christianity. Yeah? This is one of the points it's making, but generally it's about the upliftment of the caste, yeah, of the community. And but if you read that petition carefully, you will also see some other things going on. One is actually you begin to get a use of statistics. You get that only so many people from our community have jobs, which already in Malayali Memorial this was done extensively. Like there is a lot, census reports are being made use of. Yeah? People who have jobs above 5 rupees per month salary, how many from different communities? Above 15 rupees per salary, per month salary. And so these, as a proportion of the population, what percentage would that be? And how many Tamil Brahmins and other foreign Brahmins, so to say, are employed in positions which are really high? And there were lots of them, including the Diwan, who were either Tamil Brahmins or Kannada Brahmins or Brahmins from Maharashtra, who were routinely employed by the Travancore state. So these become objects of a kind of statistical argumentation, analysis and argumentation. This is a very modern kind of idiom. So this also trickles into the petition. But more interestingly, you will also see that the petition says, make some veiled threats, even though it's supplicating and speaking to the Maharaja. It says that if this situation continues, we will have no option but to leave this country which is your country and which is precious to us, or leave our religion which is also your religion which is precious to us, which should be understood in the context of the debates around conversion to Christianity which were happening around that time, and also the distinction between the political regimes of the Hindu state of princely state of Travancore and colonial Malabar. Yeah? So you have a kind of hidden threat that we also have the option of converting to Christianity or leaving Travancore in favor of other Malayalam speaking areas. So within the supplication you have this kind of thing coming up. Now interestingly, Irama Memorial was also submitted to the Diwan, and that was in English. And there the language is completely different. It's more like that language which you find in the Madras press, rational argumentation, etc., etc. There is some interesting new work which is coming up on this kind of petitioning. But the point which I want to make is that in this confluence of idioms of petitioning, you will see an insight into the nature of organization of power in colonial princely states like Travancore at that time. Like we know after Michel Foucault that the kind of kingly power where supplication is so important is what Foucault would call sovereign power, where you have a sovereign and you have subjects. Rajan Gurikar long ago had a very interesting essay on this transition from the language of being a praja into the language of being a pauran. So praja is the older category, and praja, so the kind of ritual language often is about the king looking after the praja with valsalyam. The word valsalyam comes often, which is a kind of paternal kind of emotion. And you are of course pleading, and Irava Memorial speak about children coming to their mother weeping, etc. Now, along with this sovereign power in colonial India, especially after 1857, when India becomes part of the British Empire, so to say, you have a different kind of power, which again Michel Foucault speaks about as governmental power, what he calls governmentality. Governmentality is not so much about a vertical organization of power. It is more about the state as arranging things or creating policies to manage a population. Yeah? So in Europe from the 18th century and 19th century, you have the development of this, you get all these kinds of things, like the states begin to get interested in the state of health or the state of crime in particular localities, and whether people are getting educated, all kinds of things, and delinquency, you try to manage that. If there is rampant alcoholism and violence within families, the state begin to intervene in that. And civic health becomes important. In England, there is a lot of initiatives which happened in the 19th century in relationship to prostitution, for instance, or other kinds of, what is seen as health issues. Yeah. So, governmentality is really about the management of populations. So, you may also identify that a particular population or a particular region, a particular locality may need special policies. Like, think about our modern welfare state policies, like people below the poverty line have a card which would entitle them to a certain amount of ration. Yeah? Now, poverty line itself is actually a statistical entity. As we know, the poverty line can actually be raised or lowered depending on the way you define the minimum income that is required for subsistence. There is nothing in the real world called the poverty line. The poverty line is actually a purely statistical idea. And the word statistics itself, initially its meaning is a science related to the state. Yeah? So it's actually for governmental purposes that statistics emerges as a kind of mode of knowledge, mode of apprehension of knowledge. So, but there are interesting differences when it comes to the colonial context, because colonial power at one level is sovereign power. You will see that in the Malayalam writing on, even in other languages of the East India Company, the idea of the company Bahadur. Yeah? And after 1857, at one level, the presence of the British is seen as they are like super sovereigns who are above the Maharajas, and there are territories which they are directly controlling, and even about the princely states, the Maharajas become actually minor in comparison to the British sovereignty. And there are interesting work on the way in which these darbars were held, where kings were invited, the kind of positions of seating which were given to them, the kind of regalia. And we know that the architecture of colonial cities, like when Delhi was constructed, there was a conscious attempt to emulate and surpass Mughal signs of sovereignty. So there is the idea that colonial power is essentially sovereign power. And you also have the principle of colonial difference, that all natives are actually decisively lower in comparison to people of colonial metropolitan origin. Now, at the same time, you also have governmentalization, governmentality coming in. You have policies which are developed to manage populations, address schemes which for particular communities and particular parts of society. The whole question of managing different religious communities becomes an important issue after 1857. And respecting custom becomes important. Even the whole question of law, our whole debates about personal law at the moment, they go back to the colonial differentiation of communities as part of a governmental project to manage populations. So in Travancore at that time, you see a kind of overlapping of these two registers. And so the nature of petitioning is a clear example of how they come together and merge together and gives rise to new forms. That is, on the one hand it is prayer, on the other hand you are also making arguments which appeal to the modern governmental state. Ritualistic supplication before the sovereign figure, but argumentation about rights before a governmental state. These two ideas come together, and Palpu was a major exponent of that. And Palpu, in my view, he develops this form of the petition writing into his major mode of writing. He is not somebody who published books. He only publishes one tract called the Tiyas of Travancore. If you look at the tract, you will see that many of them are letters which he wrote in newspapers. and or to government officials. These letters themselves are a form of petition writing. Newspaper articles of this kind are petition writing because their direct addressee is a state, and you are actually presenting your grievances or lack of rights before the state. But these are also public documents in the sense that these are not privately given to the state but publicized so that the moral claims you are making are made in the larger public domain. So about petitions, there is one interesting aspect to remember, that all petitions in the modern sense, they're based on certain expectations about whom you are petitioning before. Like when you say that we are suffering from these inequities, and it is the state's responsibility to address them and remedy them. Yeah. So you have an idea, you present an expectation that normatively we hold you responsible for certain things. You may actually be governing over us, but you also have certain responsibilities. We have these expectations about you which you need to fulfill. So the position of the petitioner and the addressee, the normative expectations, the relationship of power, these are made visible in petition writing. Now, Dr. Palpu in 1924, he retired and he came back to Kerala, and after that he engaged in a voluminous correspondence with colonial officials and Travancore state officials and leaders of the nationalist movement. And some of these letters actually go into 150 pages, 200 pages typed paper. And in that he develops a kind of speculative history of caste in Kerala. These are kind of eccentric writing, and people haven't really looked at them because these are not published. But in that you will see a kind of development of this petitioning mode, using that to present normative expectations and stuff of that kind. Now, we are interested in this petitioning to speak about the kind of new political discourses which are emerging in Travancore in the first decade of the 20th century. Many of these discourses actually make a distinction between the king or the prince, or whatever you want to call them, and the divan and the bureaucracy. And they subject the divan to heavy criticism and make demands upon the divan. The problems are often presented as a failure of the executive machinery headed by the divan. And at the same time, you offer ritual praise for the king. You declare your allegiance to the king, kind of creating a moral distinction between the sovereign figure and the head of the administrative state and the palace officials. Yeah? But here we have to understand that the divan is in some sense a screen, because you cannot directly criticize the king, so you often make the divan as a kind of screen for criticizing the king. Yeah? And Ramakrishna Pilla's journalistic writing developed within this field. Now, Ramakrishna Pillai edited a number of newspapers, because they kept folding up. After he publishes it for a couple of years, many of them fold up. Then Swadesha Abhimani, in the period just before his expulsion from Travancore in 1910, I think, was actually the major site of these criticisms. So in that you will see very strongly vituperative criticism against the divan and some senior palace officials. Now, if you look at it closely, you will also see that indirectly they touch upon the king on many occasions. Now, the way they touch upon the king is through a certain idea of scandal. The mode in which it touches upon the king is through scandal, often of a kind of sexual nature. Now, there is a background to this, that Sri Mulam Tirunal is said to have married a woman from a Taravada called Kaipalli house, and that lady was previously married to a palace official called Shankaran Thambi, and Shankaran Thambi suddenly rises in the palace hierarchy, and this marriage itself was seen as part of that rise, so to say. And before Shankaran Thampi's rise, the person who dominated the palace and the palace politics was somebody who is known as Sharavanai, Anandaramaya. And these two figures were seen as corrupt people and taking bribes, etc., etc. There is quite a lot of documentation on these figures in some of the colonial correspondence, which Robin Jeffrey's book, The Decline of Nayar Dominance, actually tracks. Yeah. So these two figures are the principal figures on whom Ramakrishna Pillai's editorials focus, and the Diwan P. Rajagopalachari. Yeah? So these are the figures who are the direct objects of criticism. But through this idea of scandal and sexual misconduct, you also have a kind of indirect criticism of sovereign power, indirect criticism of the king himself, without directly naming, which keeps coming up. Yeah? Now, I repeatedly use the phrase scandal, and it's important to understand how scandals work. You know. Now, scandal has, in English, the word has, you could say it has two meanings. You know. One is some kind of event which is happening in the public domain. There was a scandal. But we also use the word to refer to the event which causes the scandal. Like when somebody does something outrageous, even if it hasn't fully become the cause of public outrage, we say that that was scandalous. That was a scandalous act. Yeah. So in that sense, scandal actually refers to both these things: the event as well as the uproar which happens in the public domain. Yeah. Now, Ramakrishna Pillai's journalism sought to mobilize both these meanings, and you could say that the newspaper's reporting was also an attempt to generate scandal in that second sense. That is, scandal in the sense of create that public uproar against events which are disgusting, which are happening according to him. Now, there is a problem in speaking about these things or writing about these things in newspapers, because you will be held accountable if you actually start blaming or accusing people of things which you cannot prove. You know, then the possibility of litigation against you, prosecution, this is actually very high. So you also need to protect yourself in some way, because you may not have evidence about all things. So you will see that some of the editorials in this period, Ramakrishna Pillai does not tell you everything. You know, like, it adopts a kind of way of writing which is a little bit like the way gossip works. That he would say that on a certain day somebody was seen as walking down this, or somebody seems to have exchanged money, and sometimes he would say, "Idu vayanakkarkku ariyamallo," you know who I mean. Now, you know that in our everyday life, often gossip works in this way. You know, somebody, a group of people who say, something is happening, and somebody is going to do something. You know who I mean. And the thing is, you may not know, but still you would kind of say yes, because you don't want to be left out. Yeah. So, in other words, in gossip there is a kind of interpellation. That is, you are actually being made part of some kind of closed circuit of meaning exchange by making you complicit. That you assent to it and become part of it, and eventually by following the conversation you hope to understand. So there are some similarities between jokes and gossip, but I don't want to go there. We don't have much time. So to come back. Yeah. Anyway, to come back to this form of journalism, so you have this kind of interpellation, interpellation of the reader, and trying to protect oneself from libel, charges of libel, by not spelling out everything, but giving enough clues, so to say, to the readers. But by the time 1909, Ramakrishna Pillai begins to lose patience with all this, and he begins directly writing a lot of things against the Divan and Shankaran Thampi, etc., etc. And there was one in which he says that the Divan should be horse-whipped, and things like that. And again, that also has something to do with sexual misconduct, because he accuses the Divan of wearing immodest clothes and appearing on a balcony against the building where elite Nair women were witnessing the Arata or something like that. These are very interesting things to look at the whole. It's about exposure of the bodies, who has the right to see whose bodies. And one of the early editorials of Ramakrishna Pillai was against this practice in Padmanabha Swami temple on Arata days, when women of some of the elite palace-related families, the Amavida and all that, were required to appear without wearing blouses as part of the procession. And the procession begins within the temple, then it actually moves onto the streets. And Ramakrishna Pillai is saying that this requesting, praying that this practice should actually be given up. But if you, the way in which that essay is published and circulated makes it sound like a kind of reform tract, that women's breasts should be covered, etc., etc., and this is primitive, that kind of language. But Charai Ramadas, in a kind of very interesting archival excavation, he shows that this is not the whole story. The entire piece, if you read it, it's also complaining about the procession moving out onto the road, where it's no longer a devotional public which is witnessing it, but people of all kinds of backgrounds, including Hina Jadis, and which also includes Muslims, and are looking at these women. So that is the whole question of exposure. And this is also why scandal is important. Scandal is about an exposure which ought not to have happened. That is the kind of idea behind it. And it gives rise to certain emotions like disgust. It is meant to do that. So this is one part of the story. And of course, eventually Ramakrishna Pillai gives up these innuendos in his writing and makes his direct criticism, which results in his expulsion from Travancore. And when the police commissioner appeared in the Swadeshabhimani press to confiscate it, he found several copies of a printed book stacked up there. And he, in some stories, the police tried to take it, and Ramakrishna Pillai shouted at them saying that, don't touch those books, that is our holy Bible. And that was actually the printed copies of Narayana Kurukal's novel, Parapuram, which he had actually published. So what about who wrote this? I got these chapters into me, so I am publishing them anyway. And this is again a way of avoiding libel, prosecution, etc., etc. Now Parapuram is, and later on when Parapuram was published as a book, even before the serialization began, there was expectation about it. There were announcements, and some posters had appeared near the Kota, and those posters were removed by the police, and the shops which displayed them, those shopkeepers were called into the police station. So there was, it was a political event. There was political disturbance. Now, Parapuram, the novel, is about this imaginary place called Maranada, where there is a family called Parapuram, and there is another family called Kalpakasheri, etc., etc. And this is an allegorical representation of Travancore. It is ruled by a decadent Brahmin figure, who not really ruled. The prominent Brahmin family of the locality is that of a decadent Nambudiri figure called Atheri, and his major assistant, who actually runs the place, is a Tamil Brahmin called Andi, but his caste status is in doubt. Like in many early Malayalam novels, the caste status of a Tamil Brahmin figure, there is a doubt if he is actually really a Brahmin or a lower caste origin. That comes up, in Sharada and many other novels, it comes up. Now, also there is a young Nair figure called Keshava Pilla, who is in some sense a indirect representation of Shankaran Thampi, who initially is married to a woman who later on the Atheri marries. So there is a kind of allegorical representation of these sexual transactions which happened in the circles of power within Travancore. Yeah. Now, what's interesting to understand is that this kind of allegorization is not really a kind of working out in detail the events of the Travancore court. What you want to represent are certain set images. A decadent, weak king who is open to immoral sexual behavior, but he suffers from a general weakness of will, and he is manipulated by his servants, but he has no moral compass that he can actually be predatory in his sexual behavior towards innocent women, etc., etc. And then you have this figure called Andi, who is the Tamil assistant of Atheri, and Keshava Pilla, who loosely represent these figures in Travancore politics. But it's not like a complex psychological sketching in of these characters. Within this frame, you find the appearance of two idealized young people who are actually children in the beginning of the novel. One of them is called Pasi, a boy of unknown origins, and eventually, of course, you get to know that he has very good origins. And then there is a girl called Gomati, who is an object of the sexual predatory activities of Atheri. Eventually, these young people are reunited after going through a lot of difficulties, and they triumph, and Pasi is even made the minister by the king, and he declines that offer. There is an idealist conclusion which comes up in the last part of Parapura. So you have a kind of arrangement of things here which is based on what you call stereotyping. There is a stereotyping of figures. Characters here are essentially moral entities. They are not psychological entities. They are kind of moral entities, and that entire discourse is about a public discourse. So you will find one place where somebody is tortured unjustly, an innocent man is tortured as a result of some manipulations. In a situation of that kind, you find a policeman explaining to another character the methods of torture. Yeah? Now, these methods of torture are written in a kind of quasi-cynical tone, outlining the various techniques they use to put pressure on the body. Now, this is meant as a kind of a set piece meant for public consumption. That is, when you are reading that paragraph, you do not need to remember which character is speaking. The conversation does not give you any insight into the character. It is rather a public piece of discourse outlining the methods of torture so that they can generate some outrage. Yeah? So similarly, characters' inner thoughts. We often see the modern novel as actually invested in the interiority of characters. Yeah? You know that in Indulekha and characters in C.V. Raman Pilla's novels, there is a kind of interiority which keeps coming in, although it's a complex idea. Here, of course, in Parapuratha also there are long passages where these good characters are thinking, like Pasi is thinking about, he is reflecting on these torture methods of the police. Now, the way in which that entire passage is written up, there is nothing private or personal about it. He is reflecting like writing an essay in a newspaper about this. So you get these set pieces of discourse which are of a public nature. You do not have a conception of private emotions there. Even the interior reflections of characters are rather like public expressions. Yeah? Now, I mentioned that the political allegory is actually worked out not in great detail, but it's a loose structure which allows for certain things to come up, certain public interventions to come up. Now, when you move to the other novel, Udayakumar, you will find this developed even further. Udayakumar probably was written a bit before, it's written in 4 parts, and the last 2 parts were published much later. The last part was published in 1920s actually. So by the time Ramakrishna Pillai is dead, the nature of Indian politics has changed, Travancore politics has changed. So it's interesting to note that by the time you get to the end of Udayakumar, the nature of politics itself has undergone a change. In the early chapters, Udayakumar is written in the form of an allegory using the Mahabharata war as a kind of model, like Shashi Tharoor's great Indian novel. You have Mahabharata characters. But there are significant differences. Shashi Tharoor is interested in finding a mythological figure to represent our major political figures, like Gandhi is Bhishma, or I have forgotten many of the characters. And then he makes Draupadi. Draupadi is called Draupadi Mocracy, so that she is democracy, standing for democracy. So this is not the way in which Narayana Kurikal's allegorizing works. There is no consistent allegory there. The characters are, Pandavas and Kauravas are no longer fighting. They are on one side. They are fighting against a group called Bhishmakas, who are seen as representing these foreign elements coming into Travancore in some sense. And then all the negative characteristics which in popular imagination is associated with Duryodhanan is projected onto one of these reprehensible palace officials. So the character names are more like name calling. That is, it's not a consistent character system that is involved. But by labeling somebody Duryodhanan, somebody else, Dhritarashtra, etc., you are actually naming them and labeling them in such a way that the reader can identify what kind of moral positioning is actually being represented through them. So again, alongside this, you have a story of sexual exchanges of a corrupt nature, about incestuous relationships, about that combination of sex and power, which is important. Here, the king himself is not directly represented. There is an idea of a superior sovereignty, where finally the real king or the Chakravarti makes his appearance. He is seen as a morally upright figure, etc., etc., and he takes charge and he puts everything in order. Duryodhana and others are sent to prison. So this is the kind of idealistic political resolution towards which Udayabhanu moves. But by the time, politics had changed. 1920s, when the last volumes of Udayabhanu are written, he calls it the new political Indian nation. And you get elements of a kind of idea of nationalism which is based on a Hindu idiom, like in Bankim Chandra, for example. You find an idiom of that kind coming up. And in the last chapter, last part, when the hero and the heroine, who are separated for a long time, can I turn it off? Yeah, thanks so much. Yeah, so in the last part, when they finally meet, you would expect that according to the conventions of the novel, now they would be reunited like in Parapuram, and they would actually have great success and prosperity. But instead of that, they decide not to get married, and both of them are doing social work. The female character called Devi, she has dedicated her life to women's upliftment. And the man, Udayabhanu, he is part of the emerging nationalist movement. He wants to attain Swaraj, India to attain Swaraj. So the romantic consummation is postponed for some kind of nationalist project. A different idea of sovereignty is actually advanced there. But that is the subsequent development, just to hint at the difference of Travancore politics of the early 20th century. But both in the early parts of Udayabhanu as well as in Parapuram, what you find is a kind of political allegory writing where you are presupposing a reader who is not solely a literary reader. This is the point I am trying to make. That is, the novel Parapuram and the novel Udayabhanu cannot actually work in a purely literary space. It presupposes a reader who has been reading the newspaper, who has been reading political pamphlets, who has been following political discussions in the country. So the literary public sphere is predicated upon, and it presupposes that larger non-literary space of transactions as its material, as its ground. only a reader of that kind will identify, will even recognize that this is actually an allegory. And this is referring to these particular individuals, and what is at issue are certain events in Travancore politics. So after Parapuram was published, there were a lot of criticisms. I told you that it created a lot of debate, and these debates are essentially political debates. They are not literary debates in the sense of people saying that these are imperfect novels or something of that kind. It's political debates about its criticism of the king, whether the author should be tried for treason, things of that kind. And somebody even proposed to write a novel called Parapuram Pilarpa as a kind of counter novel, as a kind of response to this. At that time, Ramakrishna Pillai makes an interesting argument, which he writes in his newspaper as well as later on prints in the introduction to the second edition of Parapuram. He says that this is, he makes an aesthetic argument, like the Kantian argument. He says that these people who are complaining about these novels, they do not know what literature is. Literature is essentially fictional. Yeah, it's of course it is based on real life in the sense that authors are human beings and they have a range of experiences. So whatever they write is, of course, shaped by their experiences. But it doesn't mean that each character is actually modeled on a particular person. That's not the way literature works. So without understanding this nature of literature, some people after reading these novels have felt that this character in the novel resembles them, and it is a criticism of them. Ramakrishna Pillai says, they are like people who, after having committed a theft, when they come out into the street, they think that everybody looking at them is a policeman. No. So if you read a novel, and if you find a bad character as resembling you, then there might be some problem with you. But it's not a problem of the literary work. So what I'm trying to get to is this strange kind of interweaving of an aesthetic claim on the one hand and political intervention. So here the aesthetic claim, that is, literature is actually different from real life discourses, is made as an argument for making literature a means of political intervention. Yeah? So that you can do that with some degree of impunity, or you can at least make a moral claim of impunity. Yeah? So literature's specificity here is actually used for a gesture which is basically against that specificity. Yeah? That is, you say that literature is a special kind of discourse, but by saying that, you are making literature perform political functions in the real world. Yeah? So this is, you could see that this is like the converse of Ramakrishna Pillai's on journalistic writing. Because in his journalistic writing, he was actually saying that this is the discourse of truth, but I'm not going to tell you about everybody. Because I don't have the evidence. But you say that I won't reveal everything. But through that you interpellate the reader into a kind of activity which is a bit like the way fiction works. That you have an invitation to become part of a community of gossip, clandestine information, etc., etc. Yeah. So now let's come back and put this together, and then the questions we can take, and then we can stop. So what I have been trying to get at is that the literary utterances are simultaneously, they have two dimensions. On the one hand, they occupy this specific place which we call the literary domain, which emerges in the modern period, and the claim made on its behalf is that it is a separate kind of domain which needs to be assessed according to its own rules. Yeah? And we should not actually bring non-literary considerations into the assessment of these literary works. Saying that this, if you say that this novel's representation of this particular event is actually factually wrong, it is not a criticism of that novel. Yeah? So this is one of the assumptions of literature. But on the other hand, you also have a situation where all literary utterances also are utterances in that larger political space of the public domain. Yeah? So any literary utterance, even as it claims this impunity and special nature, is also addressing that larger field of readers who are non-literary readers, or even literary readers in their non-literary sentiments and life. Yeah? So in that sense, they can actually have concrete effects which are not at all of a literary character. So you have hurt, you have offense, you have libel, etc., etc. So this problem which we face in the teaching of literature is actually should be seen not as a kind of problem which we can resolve. It is actually at the heart of this entity called literature that we teach in the classroom. So I have found it dissatisfying to say that, okay, you forget the non-literary existence of literary works and assess them purely as literature. Yeah? But of course they should be, we should assess the literary work they do, They work through, like I pointed out earlier, through effects, through staging certain things, etc., etc. And simple political messages are not the politics of literature. That's all correct. But simultaneously, we also need to recognize that all literary works have a non-literary dimension of existence. Yeah? And that is part, it's not a completely separate thing. That is part of the reading experience of any literary text. It is a duality which actually constitutes the complexity of what we call literature. This is really what we need to take into account, which is why I feel that the task of literary studies, or one of the functions that literary studies can perform, is to make our students and in our own work be sensitive to the nature of that discourse and that institution that we call literature, rather than write something from within that institution. Like part of literary training is to train students to become good insiders to the literary institution. When we grade answer books, I just finished grading the JNU entrance test answer scripts, where we give a poem for people to comment on, and we give marks to people who know how to read a poem. Yeah, and I remember when I was in Delhi University, once we had given this beautiful poem called Ambulances of Philip Larkin as a poem to comment on. And people had written, somebody had written that this is actually a cold storage van carrying meat, instead of that. So you get all kinds of things. So when you are grading, you are actually thinking, who knows how to read a poem? Is there some flair for that? But all these ideas of flair, etc., etc., are about your potential to become an insider to the literary institution. Yeah? But being a student of literature or a scholar of literature, you should be not entirely an insider. You should be able to do an ethnography of that institution. Yeah? You should be able to look as if from outside and inside at the same time. What is the strange behavior that we engage in when we read a poem, or when we read a novel, or when we do academic criticism? For that we need to understand that this strange beast that we teach called literature is actually simultaneously inhabiting these two different worlds. So which is why when you see a film, when you go to watch a film, and before the film begins there is an announcement, any resemblance between characters, etc., is purely accidental, in which case you immediately know that it is not accidental, which is what the announcement is about. That disavowal of its connection with the non-literary world is an avowal of its connection. This is really what we need to work with. There are simpler ways of working with this connection, which we examined in the beginning and found unsatisfactory, like the political message, the fact of mere exclusion rather than significant exclusion, and some of the other things, the author's political messaging, the relationship is of course more complex. But we need to understand that the pure literary claims of literature, the claims of its autonomy, are also a claim in the larger public sphere, which makes this claim of autonomy a means for living that non-literary life. Now, this is really the point I wanted to make. Is it clear? The last part? Yeah, please. Yeah. So in the remaining few minutes, we can take a few questions, but tomorrow we'll create more time for discussion. Yes, please.